Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started.
Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Heidi Horsley, and I'm here today with my guest, Brittany DeSantis. Hi, Brittany.
Hi, Dr. Heidi.
We're going to be talking about something today, Brittany, that is near and dear to my heart, coping after the death of a parent. And as everybody knows, my dad died in 2020, and it's been a big deal in my life. Like, who are we without our dads? And, I don't know a life without him. So I will be very, very interested to talk to you, Brittany, because your dad died when you were only 13, and I'm going to introduce you. Brittany has taught the art of calligraphy, watercolor, and journaling to over 50,000 people worldwide, which is amazing, through your business of Peak Paper Company. Art and writing helped her cope with the death of her dad when she was just 13 years old. And it still helps you today, which I love. I love in reading about your background. You said, hey, I still miss my dad today. It's hard not to have him in my life. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Brittany wrote and illustrated a guided grief journal called Forget You Not to help others find the power of their own words when they are going through hard times. Since its publication in February 2024, Forget You Not has hit the #1 most gifted spot on Amazon and won a National Indie Excellent Award, which is amazing. Welcome to our podcast, Brittany.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so hold up your book. I want everybody to see it because it is so beautiful, and I know it's your artwork, right?
Exactly. So that's what makes us even more special because although, of course, grief is deeply personal to me and everyone listening, I wrote this journal and illustrated it in honor of my dad, but for others, as you said, to find the power of their own words when they're coping through the most difficult time of their life.
That's amazing. Tell us a little bit about your grief journey, like your background. You're 13 and your dad dies. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we just came up on the 20-year anniversary, which is so difficult to believe. But I was 13 years old when my dad passed away, and it was sudden, it was tragic. And of course, being a therapist, that there's some complicated grief with a death that happened so tragically and suddenly. And so at that time, I was gifted my very first journal. So I was 13 years old, and I was gifted a journal. And that's kind of where my now daily practice really began. And I'm so glad looking back that I had those pages to inadvertently start to cope and navigate some of those really difficult feelings. Because, of course, as a 13-year-old, you don't really know, quote unquote, how you're supposed to be feeling or how long is this feeling going to last. And there's been missed milestones along the way. For some reason, my grade 8 graduation was absolutely devastating, that my dad couldn't be there. And then, of course, that he couldn't walk me down the aisle at my wedding. And then more recently in 2021, I was pregnant with our first daughter, and I had a massive resurgence of grief. And it caused a lot of distress for me because I had thought, oh, at this point, I'm 18 years into grieving my father. At what point is this gut-wrenching feeling going to subside? And that's actually when I started going to therapy. And I said to my therapist, am I going to be an 80-year-old woman one day who's still crying about my dad? And I'm asking this desperate, like, tell me that there's a different way. And she said, yes, you will still be an 80-year-old woman who misses your dad, but it doesn't have to feel this gut-wrenching. And so that's kind of where this process and this journey in exploring how art and creativity has helped me in my life, and wanting to put that out there for others to also begin to appreciate the same sort of reward.
I love that, Brittany. And you're making such a good point that our grief transforms over a lifetime, but we still miss them over a lifetime, and it changes. You're a really great example of this. I created a class at Columbia called Traumatic Loss During Childhood that I teach that looks exactly at what you're talking about, how our grief changes over our lifespan. So like you're saying, here he wasn't at my graduation, and then again, he wasn't at my wedding to walk me down the aisle. And then tell me more about the latest reoccurrence.
It was actually when I was pregnant. So I had just found out I was pregnant with our first daughter. And,
Mhm.
there's all the emotions that come with becoming a new parent, all the joy, all of the anticipation, the excitement. And then right alongside that was this huge resurgence of grief that came out in the form of anger. And so I had a picture of him always beside my bed. And I would wake up every morning and I would feel that beautiful flutter of life in my belly. And then I would look over and see his picture on my bedside and instantly just feel mad that he wasn't going to be there for this new chapter of our lives, that he was never going to meet our daughter. And then mad at myself. Why am I still feeling this way? Why am I,
Mm.
still, and how am I going to be able to be a good parent if I'm still experiencing these feelings about my dad? And of course, I've since learned that all of these things are perfectly normal. But in the moment, it was really surprising to me. And that's when I started to talk about it a little bit more openly in my art practice, and bring people into that part of my journey and that part of my life in a way that I had previously kept quite private, because of, the nature of how we lost him and the impact that it's had on my life. So this whole, as you said, through from when he passed away 20 years ago to now, I'm absolutely still grieving my dad, but I no longer feel like that is a bad thing or that I should have been able to overcome that.
I love the way that the chapters are set up
Thank
and
you.
things that you've done to really help you go through your grief process and find hope. And I know the first one is rest,
Mhm.
one of the book chapters, and it says, "What is mindfulness and how can it help me?" Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how mindfulness has helped you?
I would love to, because that is a huge part of my business practice that I was excited to bring into the grief journal. I know you actually recently had an episode about the mind body connection when you're
Yes.
grieving. And so writing is a really great example of that, because when you're writing, you're in the moment. So, especially when I teach these very simple mindfulness writing techniques in the journal, they're tied to your breath. And so, it's a way to get your body back from this level 10 anxiety just to a better baseline. And so it's not as if there's some solution to the overwhelm and the, complex feelings that come with grief, but it helps to get you to that better baseline and give you a sense of stillness and clarity when everything just feels like it's a tornado, when, you're experiencing those deep emotions. And so when you write, instead of multitasking, it is a monotask. So it forces you to stay in the present, to think of and hear the sound of the pen on the paper, the ink, the way the ink is flowing across the page, the way that you can time your breath to how you're writing. And as you said, that's kind of the first section of the journal that I encourage people to come back to every time they sit down to write. Because whether it's, day one of grieving a loved one or 20 years in, like it is for me, you always need to get back to that better baseline before you're able to delve into some of those deeper and complex emotions, when you're writing. So I always encourage mindfulness as something that can just help us tap back into the present instead of being up in our spiraling thoughts.
I love this, and I love the idea of mindfulness as we're writing, feeling the pen, etc. And then you said that you have a chapter called "Cope: Living with Your Loss."
Mhm.
Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of misconception around grieving that I touched on, just a moment ago, around the expectations that others or ourselves place on us. So, I should be over this by now, or I shouldn't be this sad. And so, in this section on coping, we're really kind of highlighting the fact that you don't have to have perfect sentences or beautiful prose. Just the act of putting pen to paper is going to allow you to process those emotions. And I think, in generations past, there used to be this belief that if you didn't talk about things, that they would go away or they would sort of cease to exist.
Hmm.
Whereas now we know that, that actually stalls the healing process, the grieving process. And so, talking about how you're feeling, naming your emotions, putting pen to paper, has actually been proven to reduce the intensity of those emotions, both in the moment and then in the future when those emotions resurface again. So it's giving, some guidance around techniques for really difficult days, missed milestones, but also just normalizing the experience of what it means to grieve, and that it is not only okay to talk about your emotions, to talk about your feelings, but it's been proven that it's going to improve your well-being, by doing so, by writing.
I like this idea. So, looking back now at your 13-year-old self, what do you wish you had done differently after your dad died?
I think just beating myself up over perfectly normal feelings about losing your
Hmm.
parent. So I spent a lot of time feeling guilty for my dad's death, which now, as a, almost 35-year-old woman who's been to therapy and understands the grieving process differently, I know that I was not at all responsible for my dad's death. But when I was 13, I knew my dad had a substance abuse disorder. I thought, I could have done something differently. I should have been able to maybe notice the signs. I should have been able to say something or do something that would have changed his behavior. And so looking back, I would just tell myself, first of all, it's not your fault. And it never was. And second of all, to have so much self-compassion for that 13-year-old who is going through the most traumatic and impactful time of her life.
That's powerful, Brittany, because we do a lot of times, especially when you're a teenager, would have, we could have, we should have. And like you said, people shit on themselves and we judge ourselves and we're hard on ourselves and we have this idea that we could have done something different
Mhm.
when we did the best that we could. And things happen, right? As you know, um, bad things happen to good people. And your dad was a good person. And yes, he had a substance abuse problem, which doesn't make him not a good person.
Exactly.
But yes, I love how you're so candid and honest about this. I think a lot of people struggle with that. What
And
should I have done differently?
I completely agree with that. And I think it's important to note that I would not have even been able to have this conversation, let alone write the journal 5, even 10 years ago. Because I couldn't even talk about my dad without bursting into tears. It was in my body. It was so physical to me, how I was holding on to that grief. And so now it just feels like such a relief, but also such a monumental thing for me to be able to talk about it so candidly, because I absolutely could not have been doing this, as I said, 5 or 10 years ago.
So it sounds like you kind of moved it through your body by writing, right? By
Yes.
putting pen to paper, by getting it out that way. Because sometimes it's hard with words verbally, but we can express ourselves in writing, which I love. I mean, that's a great way for everybody out there listening that doesn't have the words. It's hard to have the verbal words for what we've been through. But like you said, to start putting pen to paper and expressing yourself. I know that you've got a book chapter called Reflect, which
Mhm.
honors their memory. So can you say more about honoring our memories?
This was the section that I was most excited to write because, as I said, when I was pregnant with our first daughter, and I was thinking forward to the future, how am I going to make him a part of her life and have a place that she can come to know my dad, even though she'll not meet him in person. And so I started to think of, maybe it's a book, or maybe it's, pictures of him around the house. And I started to think about this exact chapter. So how can we have a single source for all of our best memories, all of our, first memories, the ways that we remember our loved one, and the ways that our families and our friends remembered our loved ones. So I found, as even at 13 years old at my dad's funeral, I loved hearing from his friends and hearing from my aunts and my uncles stories that I was never a part of. They were maybe before I was born, or in space that my dad wasn't being a dad, he was being a friend or a brother. And so in this particular chapter of the journal, we talk about asking friends and family members, how they would describe your loved one in 3 words, or to tell you a story that maybe you've never heard before. And it kind of builds a bigger picture in your mind of the person that they were to you, and becomes again this heirloom, that you can look back on. So there's a section for inserting photographs, and being able to write a little memory beneath each photograph as well. And again, just becoming this sort of capsule. And I give an example within that chapter of how I did this, for my daughter and my dad. While I was writing this journal, my mom found the first card, that my dad wrote to me, and it was for my first communion. And it said, "You are a very special girl. The love within you is felt by all those around you." And it was signed in his signature,
Mm.
all capital writing, "Love Daddy, XXOXX." And I scanned that in, got it printed on beautiful heirloom quality paper, framed it and matted it, and I put it as the first piece of artwork in my daughter's nursery. And it was so special to
That's
me, obviously, as a professional calligrapher, as an artist, now seeing
mhm.
my dad's handwriting and it meaning so much more to me now than I could have ever known possible all those decades ago. So just an example of a way that we can, memorialize, commemorate our loved ones in a very unique way.
Yeah. Brittany, I love that example. And I think one of the reasons we're on this earth is to keep our loved ones' memories alive. I mean, my brother was 17 when he died in a car accident, and my kids know him through me, even though they've never met him.
Exactly.
So it's exactly what you're saying. I mean, we have to keep these stories alive, these memories alive for the next generation, and you're certainly doing that. The last chapter is pretty powerful. Learn, where
Mhm.
you say, "Who am I now?"
Yeah. And I think, I mean, you will know exactly what I'm talking about, that your perception of life, of death, of everything changes when you
Yeah.
lose someone that you love. And so this chapter, maybe it's not something that if your loved one passed away yesterday that you would even want to touch this chapter. So I talk about
Hmm.
that in the beginning of the journal, just sort of a guide on how to move through the chapters and to take what resonates and leave what doesn't for a time that it feels more resonant. But for those that whether it's been days or decades since their loved one passed away, this learn section is just about acknowledging to yourself how much you have changed. And you're probably familiar with the Dr. Lois Tonkin theory on grief and how
Hmm.
you grow around your grief. So when you
Yeah.
first lose that person, it's this dark hole of grief and it kind of overtakes everything. And as we keep living, as we keep adding joyful moments to our life, we begin to grow around that dark center of grief instead of it being the biggest part of our life. And so this whole final section of the journal is just acknowledging how your perception of life and death has changed, what advice you would potentially give to others, just as a way of getting you to articulate, potentially what your thoughts and feelings are now compared to what they would have been. And then ending on some affirmations. So, what your beliefs might be, and then changing those to an affirmation. So, a belief might be, I shouldn't be this sad. And an affirmation might be, I'm allowed to be this sad. And so, just
Hmm.
kind of getting us to acknowledge that, these feelings are perfectly normal. There is no solution to grief. I'm certainly not on any sort of other side of it, and just giving us some tools and techniques to begin to continue to live a full life while still grieving our loved ones.
I love this. I really love this. The "Who am I now" is important because, like you said, we have to figure out who are we now,
Mhm.
and and sometimes reinvent ourselves and incorporate our loved ones into our lives in different ways, in new
Exactly.
ways that have died. And I love that you end on a high note. Any last bit of advice for parents out there who have teenagers that are grieving the death of a parent?
Absolutely. I think even just in general, one of the lines in my journal is, we don't have to have any answers or perfect sentences or beautiful prose. We just need to slow down and put pen to paper. And in the simple act of expressing ourselves, even if those words never see the light of day, writing lightens the load. So that to me sort of encompasses everything about what writing can do, particularly, at a young age where maybe you don't necessarily feel like you're a writer. You don't identify as somebody who knows how to write beautifully or perfect sentences, and just kind of taking that pressure off, and just write to express, not to impress anyone. So you're just simply putting pen to paper. And even if you write it on a sticky note and tear it to shreds, I would absolutely recommend that as a tool for teens grieving the loss of their parent, and for adults grieving the loss of a spouse, anyone sort of that that you've lost in your life. It really is just such a beautiful way. And not just writing, but painting and drawing and any sort of creative expression. There's just so much science and research and evidence now that can back up what we're talking about. And that's the fascinating part to me, as I've always been doing these things since I was a
Hmm.
child, but to know now that it really does reduce your stress response. It lowers your heart rate. It kind of just brings you back to that stillness and clarity that is so needed when you just kind of feel like you're spiraling out of control at some points, to just normalize that.
Well, thank you so much, Brittany. We're going to end on that note because I think you brought up so many valid and important points. And thank you so much for giving so many people hope with this book. So please go out and get Brittany's book. It is called Forget You Not. Thanks
Yes,
so
and
much, Brittany.
thank you. And it is available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, pretty much anywhere books are sold, as well as some additional. There's a free painting class on my website to learn how to paint the florals on the cover. So that's at peakpaperco.com.
Oh, I love that. So give us your website again.
peakpaperco.com, and you'll find links to everything book related in the navigation tab there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brittany, for being on our show today.
Thank you, Dr. Heidi.
We always say, if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you found your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.